Hey everyone, in today's video we're going to talk about basic camera settings in under 5 minutes. Well, we're going to try to go under 5 minutes, but we'll see. My goal with this video is to help you take better photos in no time. And if you ever get confused, you can just refer back to this video. First thing we're going to talk about is aperture. Aperture controls how much light is let into the camera, and this is measured in f-stops like f1.8, f8, f11. If you want to go for a shallow depth of field where the background is really blurred out but your subject's in focus, you'll want to shoot at a lower f-stop like f1.8, f2. If you want more in focus, like you're shooting a landscape scene, you'll want to be shooting at around f8, f11, where you'll get much more of a depth of field. So portraits, shoot at a lower f-stop, landscapes, shoot at a higher f-stop. Next up is shutter speed. Shutter speed controls how long the camera sensor is exposed to light. So if you're shooting at 1/1000th, it's a really quick shutter, and that's really good for freezing motion. So if somebody's running and you want them perfectly in focus and sharp and no motion blur, you'd shoot at that. Or if you want to shoot birds and they have their wings out and you want their wings to be as sharp as possible and not blurred out, you'd be shooting at 1/1000th, 1/2000th, anything like that. So it's really good for wildlife photography and moving subjects, and sports photography is a big one. Slower shutter speeds like 1/30th introduce motion blur. So if you want to show movement in the photo, you would go to like 1/30th of a second. And you can even go slower than that to a 1-second exposure, 2-second exposure, 30-second exposure. There's even a bulb setting where you can hold down your shutter and it stays open for as long as you hold down the shutter for. Now this is good for doing long exposure photography, such as waterfalls, light trails, star photography, all that sort of stuff. Now shutter speed is super important because if you have shaky hands, you don't want to be shooting at a lower shutter speed where when you shake your hands a little bit, you'll actually introduce motion blur into the camera and it'll blur out your entire photo. For me personally, if I'm shooting handheld, I like to shoot at 1/200th of a second or higher, but that's mainly just because I have really shaky hands. So most of the time I bring my tripod with me and I lock it off if I'm going anything lower than that. Next up is ISO. ISO is how sensitive your camera or your film is to light. A low ISO like 100 will have almost no grain in it. But if you have a higher ISO like 1000 or 2000, you'll have much more grain. And if you have a lot of grain, it can actually de-sharpen your photo a little bit. But we have editing software nowadays that you can denoise photos and it actually looks pretty good. But it's generally better to shoot at a lower ISO where you'll have less noise and a sharper photo. Now, when would you want to bump up your ISO? Well, it depends. If you're shooting in a low light situation, then you'll want to raise your ISO to compensate for the lack of light. But if you're going for something artsy where you have a little bit of light but everything's dark, then you can kind of play around with your ISO settings there too. Now with film photography, your ISO can't be set. You have to buy each individual film cartridge, and each individual film cartridge will have its own ISO. So you can get ones at 100, you can get ones at 800. And if you're going to go shoot something in lower light, you would want to buy something like Portra 800. If you're shooting during the daylight, you can go down to 400 or anything lower than that. But 400 is kind of a good middle ground where if you don't know if you're going to be shooting in a lower light situation or if you're going to be shooting during the day, you can kind of stick to ISO 400 film, and that kind of gives you a decent window. Now let's talk about the exposure triangle. See, all of those things that I just mentioned before, they all work together. If you change one setting, odds are you'll have to change another setting, so they can balance themselves out. Now let's talk an example of that for 1 second. Let's say you want to shoot a landscape shot handheld. For me personally, with my shaky hands, I would shoot at anything higher than 1/200th of a second to compensate for the shake. Now, if it's a landscape shot, you want to be shooting at anywhere from f8 to f11 to get everything in focus and sharp. Now, if it's during the day, you can keep your ISO low down to 100, but if you're starting to shoot more closer to sunset or sunrise or you're in blue hour, then you'll probably want to raise your ISO up a little bit more. So depending on how much light we have, I'd probably go ISO 400, ISO 600, something like that. but it really just depends on how much light you have in the scene. Now, if you don't want to raise your ISO, then you can lock off your camera on a tripod, drop your shutter speed to 1/130th, 1/40th. Keep in mind that there could be motion blur. If it's really windy, you'll see that. But then that lets more light into the camera, which means you can actually lower your ISO. Opening up your aperture too will let more light in, but like I was saying before, if you're shooting a landscape scene and you want more in focus, then you'll want to be shooting at f8, f11. Now there's way more that we could go in depth into with photography basics, like talking about bracketing or focus stacking, but we'll leave that for another video. This is just the bare bones basics of cameras. So if you guys enjoyed this video, like, comment, subscribe. I'd love to see you guys back here hanging out in another video. And if you like this sort of camera basics thing, let me know. I'll make more of them. All right, that's it for today's video. You guys have a good one. Peace.